Hello everyone. I will share real stories that I know and I'm sure you will like them.
I never expected to spend the night stuck in a snowstorm with my husband's best friend. But life has a strange way of setting up moments you never see coming. It had started as an innocent weekend getaway, my husband, a few of his friends, and me, all heading up to a cozy mountain cabin for a few days of relaxation. The plan was simple: good food, warm fires, and maybe a little skiing if the weather allowed. But as fate would have it, the weather didn't allow much of anything. By the second night, the storm had rolled in hard. Heavy snow pounded against the windows, the wind howling through the trees like a warning. We had planned to head back that evening, but the roads were already buried, and the power had flickered twice, threatening to go out completely. "Looks like we're staying put," my husband sighed, setting his phone down. No signal, no way out until morning. The rest of the group grumbled in agreement, but there was no real protest. We had enough food and blankets, and the cabin, with its rustic charm and oversized stone fireplace, was more than comfortable. If anything, it felt like an extended vacation. But then, my husband got a call. Somehow, despite the lack of signal, his boss had managed to reach him. Something urgent had come up back in the city, something that couldn't wait. He paced the cabin, frustration evident in the lines of his face. "I'll have to try to get down the mountain tonight," he finally said, grabbing his coat. "I'll take the truck. Chains should get me through." I stared at him. "Are you serious? The roads are terrible." "I don't have a choice." His friend, Jake, stood from his spot by the fire. "I'll go with you." My husband shook his head. "No, stay here. If the storm gets worse, someone needs to make sure she's not alone." Jake glanced at me, and for the first time that night, I felt the weight of his gaze linger just a little too long. It was subtle, barely a second, but it was enough to send a small shiver down my spine. "I'll be fine," I assured them both, forcing a small smile. "It's just one night." But I didn't realize just how long the night would feel. An hour after my husband left, the power finally gave out. The fireplace flickered, casting long shadows against the wooden walls, and the temperature inside began to drop rapidly. Jake stood, stretching. "We should get more wood before it gets too cold." I nodded, pulling my sweater tighter around me. "Good idea." We worked together, hauling logs inside, stacking them near the hearth. The movement helped keep me warm, but as the night deepened, the cold started to settle in my bones. I wrapped a blanket around myself, sitting close to the fire, rubbing my hands together for warmth. Jake sat across from me, his own blanket draped loosely over his shoulders. He watched me for a moment, then shook his head with a chuckle. "You're shaking." "It's freezing in here," I murmured, my teeth lightly chattering. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Come here." I hesitated, blinking at him. "What?" He smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Body heat works better than any blanket." I swallowed hard. It was a simple, logical statement. Nothing inappropriate. And yet, the way he said it, the way his voice dropped just a little lower than usual, it sent a warmth through me that had nothing to do with the fire. "I don't think. It's either that or you freeze. Your call." I let out a shaky breath, considering my options. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and my fingers were already going numb. It was just warmth, nothing more. Slowly, I stood, crossing the small space between us. He opened his blanket, and I hesitated for just a moment longer before sinking down beside him. The moment he wrapped it around me, the heat of his body pressed against my side, I felt the difference instantly. "Better?" he asked quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. The fire crackled beside us, the only sound in the room apart from the occasional gust of wind rattling the cabin walls. I was acutely aware of every point where we touched, his arm resting against mine, the solid warmth of his chest rising and falling in steady breaths. I tried to focus on anything else. The fire, the storm, the distant hope that my husband had made it safely down the mountain. But then Jake shifted, his hand brushing against my arm as he adjusted the blanket, and suddenly, breathing felt a little harder. "See? Told you I'd keep you warm," he murmured. His voice was closer than before, his breath warm against my ear. My stomach twisted, a slow realization settling deep inside me. I had underestimated the cold, and I had underestimated him. The fire flickered low, casting moving shadows along the wooden walls. I could feel the weight of exhaustion settling into my body, but I was too aware of everything: the warmth of Jake beside me, the steady rise and fall of his breath, the way the cold still nipped at the tips of my fingers despite the blanket wrapped around us. I should have moved, created distance. But the truth was, the warmth was too good to pull away from, and a part of me, a part one wasn't ready to acknowledge, didn't want to. The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the trees, rattling the windows. There was no leaving, no distracting myself with anything but this moment, this impossible closeness between us. I could feel every shift of his body, every small adjustment, and when his hand brushed against mine beneath the folds of the blanket, I sucked in a quiet breath. "You okay?" he murmured, his voice low and quiet in the dim space. I nodded, though my pulse had picked up, betraying me. "Yeah, just trying to get comfortable." Jake chuckled softly, the sound deep and smooth. "Me too." We fell into silence again, but it wasn't empty. It was thick, weighted with something we weren't speaking aloud. I wasn't naive enough to pretend I didn't notice it. The way his fingers lingered just a second too long when he adjusted the blanket, the way his voice had taken on that lower, rougher edge. "You're still freezing," he said after a moment, shifting slightly beside me. "Come here." I hesitated, but only for a second. The rational part of me was slipping, lost in the comfort of the moment, the exhaustion, the overwhelming need for warmth. Slowly, cautiously, I leaned into him, letting his body absorb the chill from mine. His arm came around me, natural, effortless, as if we had done this 100 times before. "Better?" he asked. I swallowed. Yeah, it should have ended there. We should have drifted to sleep, lulled by the fire, the storm, the exhaustion of the day. But then he shifted, his breath warm against my temple, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought we'd be here," he murmured, almost like he was speaking more to himself than to me. I turned slightly, just enough to meet his gaze in the dim light. "Me neither." Jake's eyes searched mine, something unreadable flickering in them. He was close, too close, and yet I didn't move. I didn't pull away. His hand, which had been resting against my arm, traced the lightest path along my skin, almost absent-mindedly, but I felt it like a slow-burning fire. "I should let you sleep," he murmured, though he made no move to pull away. I let out a soft, unsteady breath. "Probably." The silence stretched, the air between us charged with something we had no name for. And then, finally, he shifted just slightly, just enough to create space, just enough to pull away before either of us did something we couldn't take back. I let out a slow breath, my head resting against his shoulder as I stared into the dying embers of the fire. The storm still raged outside, but inside, the only thing I could hear was the steady, rhythmic beat of my own heart. Nothing had happened, nothing explicit, and yet everything felt different. I knew, without a doubt, that I had crossed a line. And even worse, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go back.